Welcome to the Solid Verbal. And now, Dan and Ty.
Dan Rubenstein's special episode today. We are going through in painstaking detail the latest update that the New York Times made to its top 22 pizza restaurants in New York City.
Yeah, of course.
Gonna be a bit of a zag. Normally this is college football. Today it's all...
Yeah, that's what people are demanding in late May. So, I don't have any thoughts. I think you should eat the pizza that you like, and you should try new pizza and see where that fits into your world. And New York has a lot of excellent pizza with many different styles, and I have my favorites, and you have your favorites, and you should, do what makes you happy.
Do what makes you happy.
There's a lot of places on this list I've been to, and there are a lot of places on this list that I'd very much like to try. New York is a big place. It's hard to get around sometimes to, deeper stretches of different boroughs. But, if you're dedicated to the cause, Ty, there's no place too far away. Like, I'll go eat pizza in Tokyo. I'll eat pizza in Italy. I'll eat pizza in Juneau. Wherever pizza takes me, I'm willing to go.
Beautiful. Well, hopefully, for those folks that are out there, part of what makes you happy is listening to the show. Yes, thank you. Hit follow, hit subscribe if you're new here. 2 episodes a week all throughout the off season. Although next week, I think we're going to be taking a day off because of Memorial Day holiday. Mm-hmm. We'll see if the spirit moves us and if we end up with 2 episodes next week. But you will get at least one. We promise you that. Verballers.com is where you can go if you want to further support what Dan and I do. We've been doing these episodes now where we go through individual teams, talk through trajectory. That's a big word, but trend lines. Are teams going in a good direction, going in a bad direction? Well, the team today is Penn State, and Penn State, by many accounts, could be the top team in the country going into 2025. And frankly, I don't know how to deal with that. So we're going to have Ben Jones on, our friend from Ben Jones on Penn State. Substack.com. Ben's doing his own thing. Would encourage folks to go out there and listen and read Ben's commentary. Always very thoughtful, very much has his finger on the pulse of what's going on in the Penn State world. So just want to have him on to help me kind of dissect how I should feel, my own feelings about these lofty expectations that have been placed on Penn State. So we'll do that in just a little bit.
Hey, real quick, it'd be great if you could consider subscribing to the YouTube channel down below. It really helps us out.
I guess before we do, though, we should mention this. Our friend Ross Dellinger from over at Yahoo Sports reporting that college football playoff executives are expected to adopt a straight seeding model for this season's college football playoff. So it would just be for this season because they're going to change it again.
Of course.
Right? The following season, they're going to expand it to 14 teams, at least as of now, 14 teams. I guess that could get bigger. But a straight seeding model, what does that mean? Well, on the episodes that we did all last year, when we were describing to the masses what exactly the college football playoff would look like and how it would be structured and seeded and how the matchups would work, there was this whole bit of translation that needed to occur.
But now,
well,
less so.
I guess less translation.
It's the 14 playoff extrapolated into 12 with mandatory G5 team thrown in there, wherever that G5 team should end up.
Before we had the rankings are not the same as seedings, and now they kind of are. Right. So the way it would have worked last year is your Oregon Ducks would have been number 1 overall. Sure. Georgia would have been 2. Texas would have been 3. Penn State would have been 4. Notre Dame would have been the 5 seed. They'd have been playing Clemson, who was the 12. Ohio State would have played Arizona State. Tennessee against SMU. Indiana against Boise State. It still would have been the same teams, but we would have had a little bit of a different setup with respect to the actual matchups. I think this is a good move forward. Again, it's the same teams that we're talking about here within the context of this discussion. The numbers and the matchups and whatnot change. Look, the sport has gotten really complicated, as we have mentioned time and again on this show.
Yep.
If you're a new fan trying to pick up college football, or even if you're an old fan trying to pick up the new wrinkles in college football, it's gotten really complicated between the playoff and NIL and the transfer portal and all of these new things that we have to try and digest. The seeding, I always thought was kind of unnecessary the way they did it last year. They did it. to their credit, if they change it, I think it's a move in the right direction. Just kind of keep it simple, stupid for those of us who are stupid. And let's just go by the college football playoff rankings. Let's use that as the seeding. Like you said, you got the mandatory G5 team that we want as part of this tournament. That might make things a little bit more complicated. Won't make it exactly apples to apples, but it's still going to be, I guess, a closer disciple of whatever we see on Tuesday nights. So big winner would be the Tuesday night rankings reveal. Maybe we get a sense for what the committee is thinking. Maybe we don't. But it sounds like they're going to go in this direction with the seeding. I don't know if you have any hot takes or reactions to this, Dan. It seems pretty straightforward to me. It's been rumored for a while. I wasn't sure that they were going to do it so soon.
Right.
It had been rumored that maybe they would, and then no, they weren't. And now it's, I guess, apparently back on here. So what are your thoughts?
Well, look, assuming that it's still going to be the top 5 champions in, right? That's what it has been, the top 5 conference champions in. So you're kind of devaluing in terms of seeding what you end up doing in a conference championship game. Clemson and ASU and Boise State, I believe, were the big leapers going from the rankings to the seedings. Most notably,
right.
I think ASU finished the year number 12 and was seeded number 4. And so if you are disadvantaging teams that are ranked lower, not disadvantaging them, but not advantaging them in the same way, that's not the worst thing, though it does make a conference championship game less meaningful, I think.
Well, yeah, because the way that it was structured before, to your point, right? Okay, top 5 conference champions automatically get in. Before, the top 4 were getting first-round buys.
Right.
That's how ASU ended up in that 4 seed. So in this setup, ASU wins the Big 12. They're not getting a bye like they did last year. Like I said, they would be first-round game against Ohio State.
Right.
So that changes things to the point on Clemson. Clemson did win, the ACC. In this setup, they would have been the 12th seed. They would have been seated lower than the team that they beat in the ACC title game.
So
does that matter to you? I don't know if the number really matters. Getting in is probably the most important thing, but this is where we start, I think, breaking this down in terms of who gets the buys, who gets the home games, things of that nature.
Yeah, and obviously, look, so it changes the number of games likely that a team like Oregon would have played last year. Does it change the fact that Oregon, for a chunk of the Ohio State game, didn't look like they belonged on the same field? Probably not. No, it probably does not change the result of an Oregon-Ohio State matchup unless it allows, perhaps players to heal more who would have made more of a difference. But then you're also talking about Ohio State players potentially healing more who would have made more of a difference. So, no, I don't think ultimately you're looking at a non-Ohio State champion if this were in place last season. But I understand from the perspective of teams who were knocked down for being more successful than other teams throughout the entirety of the season, at least in the eyes of voters, being upset with how the seedings worked out last year. And this is always going to be a sport, and it's always going to be a postseason of unintended consequences. And so I still think we would have had a very entertaining college football playoff if it had been seeded in this way. But you're also looking at Penn State would have been a 4 seed, right?
Yes.
In this instance.
4 seed with the first round bye, and they would have played, if this went according to chalk,
right,
they would have played Notre Dame in the second round instead of the semifinals.
Right. And then also Texas would be a top 4 seed after losing they would have been, I think, the 3 seed.
They would have been the 3 seed. They would have gotten Ohio State in the second round.
Right. And so they still had Ohio State in last year's college football playoff. And ASU still had Texas if ASU had gotten through in this alt universe. So, no, not a ton of changes, but it does make you think about what the future of conference championship games are as the playoff expands. And it seems that a bigger priority for a lot of these schools is going to be to best position oneself for the college football playoff rather than win a game in Indianapolis or Northern Texas or wherever. It's difficult to see the conference championship part of this sport maintaining importance.
They need to do what we mused about on one of our bonus episodes. They need to give the 5, the 6, the 7, and the 8 seed the opportunity to pick who their first round matchup is against. I would love that, Dan. The content. Oh, the content is dripping.
The content is great. The concept of the content, but the adding complications to the college football playoff.
Let's take this thing that we have already overcomplicated and now potentially are simplifying and make it more complicated so that it is even harder to grasp.
Right.
I understand that. I'm just thinking of it from the standpoint of, hey, we need something to talk about. And that would be something to talk about. That would be a Tuesday night show that you and I would watch.
Yeah, of course. But I don't know if it's for the good of the understanding of this playoff. So
No. Of course not.
Yeah, this makes sense. And you are going to get some reruns. You're going to get perhaps more often. You are going to get some teams who perhaps are seated lower than it seems like they should be, or teams that are seated higher than it seems they should be. And, not having the conference championship element decide things in the same way is definitely different. But I don't know. I think it's fine. Ultimately, I don't think it's going to change a ton. Like, we're going to get the matchups we're going to get either way. And so, the 2024 Penn State team is perhaps a big victim here of, like, they're going to have to play more difficult games earlier. They had a great seeding run, as good as SMU was, to host SMU on just an absolute garbage winter day in State College, and then to get Boise State, to get a team that lost its conference championship game in its first season as a power conference team, and then a Boise State team. It's a nice run despite not winning the Big Ten, with Oregon getting Ohio State in their first game. So maybe we don't see that as often, but like Penn State earned a top 4 seed last year.
They earned a top 4 seed. And look, I'm open to changing the idea.
Yeah.
If you want to give the game draft idea to the top 4 seeds and not just the 4 teams that have to play home games in the first round, I'm cool with that too. Let Oregon pick, let Penn State, Georgia, Texas in this setup, let them pick who they play in round 2. Either way, let's add some element of, fantasy draft to this to make it a little bit more intriguing.
The important thing here is it does not change the fact that Alabama would still be left out with their horrendous losses.
Oh my gosh. Dan.
Yeah. So that's some things are consistent, Ty.
Some things are consistent. You can always write in solidverbal@gmail.com. Let us know your thoughts on, this new seating setup, whatever we want to call it. Straight seating now is what we're calling this. Of course, you can reach out on social media as well. The topic du jour, though, is Penn State.
Yes.
We know that this is a program that's been trending in a good direction. That part goes without saying. They were just 3 points away from playing for the national championship. But, of course, with that success comes, I think, a bunch of questions, of course, about how you can make the team better. What is James Franklin's state of mind, right? Did he actually get the monkey off his back now by winning a couple playoff games, by going to that semifinal, by having a near miss against Notre Dame? They only lost 3 games last year, 3 one-score games against Ohio State, against Oregon, and against Penn State in the national semifinal. How close is Penn State to getting over that hump, to getting to that title game, to maybe winning a national championship? We save those hard questions for our good friend Ben Jones, who joins us now. How are you, Ben?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, fellas. Good to be here.
Good to have you. So you heard the preamble. There are a lot of expectations floating about for Penn State right now. What are we supposed to do with these expectations, Ben? Like, how do you feel about it? Obviously, everyone's releasing their way too early top 25s, and clearly this is going to be a good team, but how good, that seems to be the open question. Where are you at now with some of what you've seen float about there in terms of expectations?
Yeah. I mean, I think Penn State has clearly been at the point for a while now where you can go, okay, they should probably win 10 games. Let's talk about the other 2. And now in the college football playoffs being expanded, it's kind of, tinkered with the thinking of what do you want out of Penn State. But to me, are they going to be a good team? Yes. I think like I said, we've gotten past the overall question of, is Penn State going to be any good? The answer is yes. Are they going to win those big games? I don't know that there's anything about Oregon that early in the year that you go, oh, they can't win that game. So, to me, Penn State
at home. Yeah.
At home, you should feel comfortable about that in theory if you had to pick. But I think big picture, it's gotten to seeing is believing point for me when it comes to the wide receiver room. I think Penn State pretty much faked its way almost to the national title game without a true number one receiver, which I think is, a testament to having a really good tight end and good running backs. But at the end of the day, Penn State's not just going to suddenly be the one team that manages to win a national title without a wide receiver that it can rely on or on a regular basis. And without Tyler Warren, I think that gets more difficult. So should you have high expectations? Sure. Because we don't know who that receiver might be, does that mean it's not there? No, I think obviously you have forever and a half to develop guys, but I put Penn State in the same place I've been putting Penn State for the last better part of the half decade or so. Is they'll be really good. Will they beat Ohio State? I don't know that we have the answer to that question now, because we never have the answer to that question until 6 minutes ago in the fourth quarter.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the offense was better. The passing game statistically was better, but they lost Tyler Warren, but they lost pretty much the entire receiver room. Guys transferred out. They've brought in some guys. The question is, and I think you touched on it already, I don't know if any of us really has the answer for it. Is that going to be enough? Is that going to be enough? It's sort of like a big old shrug, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think if, the guys they bring in, if they can produce, I think, Drew Allar, when he's at his best, can make every throw that you need a quarterback to make. And I think that he can make a lot of those throws better than a lot of people. So I think if you can get him the help, he can be excellent, and Penn State can win a lot of games. And I think to his credit, I think Drew Allar suffers a little bit from a remixed version of Christian Hackenberg syndrome, where you anticipate that because he's really good, he will make up for everyone else's shortcomings. And obviously Hackenberg had a lot more things to deal with, and we're a decade behind having to unpack that again. But I think, Drew, to a certain extent, people expect him to be Trevor Lawrence or this guy that comes in and immediately can just do everything. I think he needs the help. And if these guys that they brought in can do that, then, the answer might be yes, especially, I think every good quarterback's best friend is a good running game. And I don't think there's any question that Penn State's going to have that this year. So, I guess we'll see, but certainly Penn State's not very many pieces away. I think I sound pessimistic. I think I've just seen a lot of Penn State football. Right. But at the same time, there's no reason to think that they're going to be bad.
The Allar versus receiver room conversation is an interesting one. It's one that we've had on the show. I've seen it talked about online. I'm sure you've discussed it at some point as well. The issues that Penn State had with its passing game, how much of that blame do we put on the receiver room versus how much do we put on a guy like a Drew Allar, who, as I've said time and again on this show, did pick up the position later on relative to his peers. He's still very much learning the position. I think he showed real progress last year, but there are definitely elements of his game that even he would openly acknowledge need to improve. Is the blame for you still mostly on the fact that they weren't having guys get open? Or is it Allar,
trepidation,
still kind of comprehending the system?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, like everything in sports, we want it to be binary, but it's a little bit of both. I think at the same time, if Penn State had Jahan Dotson on that team, I'm sure that Drew Allar would be hitting him a lot more than he was, the primary guys that he had last year. So to me, are there areas that Drew can improve? I think there's no question. Like you said, Drew said that himself. Do you watch games and go, oh, he threw that into the ground, or he missed a guy, or, that's every quarterback in the country. But I do think at the same time, you can look at areas and go, yeah, Drew's got to get better at this, or he's got to get better at that. And I think for the most part, when you start where he was to where he is today, he's gotten better at those things. But again, if guys are open, Jahan Dotson ended up going in the first round because he bailed Sean Clifford out of so many, throws that normal people wouldn't catch. That, I think if there was a guy out there that Drew was just missing consistently, you would go like, okay, what is the deal here? But at the same time, they haven't been there. Penn State's proven pretty consistently up until the last few years that it can produce one or two NFL caliber wide receivers per unit of time. And that just has not happened the last few years. And to me, the quarterback hasn't gotten any worse and arguably has gotten better. So the thing that's changed is the personnel you've got in that wide receiver room. So it's a little bit of both, but I still tend to lean more towards the receivers.
So what happened? Why is the personnel grouping in the receiver room not one that produces a go-to guy? Obviously, there's been turnover at receivers coach these last few years. Has there been a change in strategy? Has there been a change in vision from up top and James Franklin? Because, like you mentioned, this is a school that produces receivers. You go back even as recently as Parker Washington, who was like, oh, Parker Washington got better every year and emerged as a true threat by the time he left State College. What changed on that sort of line of succession where suddenly it's, well, maybe this fourth best guy from Ohio State is the answer. Oh, maybe this guy from Kent State is the answer. What is there a specific event that you can look at and be like, ooh, this is where it turned?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Penn State still misses Josh Gaddis. For my money, I think that's a coach that they miss on a regular basis. I have not spent a lot of time with Marquez Hagan, so I don't want to, obviously we're not in situations where we get to watch these guys coach each and every day or whatnot, but he has never, for my money, come across as a guy that you go like, he has all the answers and he will solve this problem for you. Now, I don't think that a guy like the Hagans ends up being Penn State football's wide receiver coach and doesn't know what he's doing. Like, you didn't get to this point in your career without the aptitude that allows you to get here. But at the same time, I do think that they missed that developmental piece. I think obviously, Penn State has not recruited wide receivers as well as it has recruited other positions. If we are putting stock in what is your ranking, what is your star ranking, those sorts of things, that they bring in a lot of 3 or 4 star guys, and you can make a lot of really good wide receivers out of that. But you look at the top end guys that they've gotten, and obviously Justin Shorter's career didn't really pan out anywhere necessarily. So that's, in Penn State, and I don't think Ohio State will really, no one really takes, I don't think Julian Fleming is necessarily a guy that should be blamed for not being as good as people thought he would be. It's not a moral failing, but he's another guy that didn't necessarily pan out the way that anyone expected. So yeah, I mean, when you don't get those really, really high end guys, when you bank on your ability to develop and then the development doesn't quite fit in, I don't think Mike Yursich was necessarily the answer at times for how do you fix this problem. I don't know that Marquez Hagans is necessarily the end of the line in terms of best wide receiver coach you could ever get, and Drew's got to get better. So I think all of those things kind of mold you into a room that's not as good as it should be and probably not as good as it has been. And I think probably a little bit of everything has to change if Penn State wants to get back to where it was at that position.
So we're sort of lamenting where Penn State is as a receiving school, but if Penn State is being compared to the other schools that are thought of in this like top 1, 2, 3, 4 area of the country, with take your pick, Texas, Georgia, Oregon, Notre Dame, whoever, where is Penn State's advantage over, or where are they comparable to where they're in this conversation? Obviously, they're winning games. The proof is there. The recent success is there. But when you compare against other schools, you're like, oh, Penn State, like it's on the edge. It's at linebacker. It's in the secondary. It's the running back duo. Like, is it the sum of the parts of Penn State, or is there a group of stars or star power where you're like, Penn State has them?
I mean, I think it's a bit of both. Obviously, if you look at a running back room like Nick Singleton and Kaytrone Allen, you go, everyone in America would take that tandem given the opportunity. So I think any given program is going to have its strengths in terms of, wow, our personnel is really good right now. I think if you compare Penn State to itself, 10 years ago or so and go, what was the issue there, is they didn't really have the next guy in line at every position. And obviously, every program is kind of chasing that. The thing that Ohio State has perfected for a really long time, which is it doesn't matter that we just lost, Marvin Harrison Jr. We've got, this guy that we can plug in here, Jeremiah Smith. We can just put another guy in. And Penn State's maybe not there, but I think at certain positions, running back, they've done a really good job. Tight end, they've done a really good job. And for whatever you want to parse about, the sort of lineage of Penn State football quarterbacking, they've never really had just like an outright bad college football quarterback under James Franklin when they've been at full sort of capacity, so to speak. Obviously, defensively, You can look at linebacker and defensive end and safety, really pretty much every position defensively. But I think the big thing for Penn State, and I think we've seen it with Pat Kraft, is just sort of a willingness to, like, I've called it the get rich or die trying scheme, which is like there had been a long sort of systemic belief at Penn State, I think, that progress had to be sort of gradual and careful. And to Penn State's credit, it found a lot of success that way in college football, and athletics at large have changed a lot over the last 20 years, that, doing things methodically worked a lot better. I think Pat Kraft has said, we're all going to die one day. We may as well spend some money on our football program.
Hell yeah. Let's do it.
I think that is an area where, Penn State has wanted to compete with the Ohio States and Michigans and Alabamas and teams like that, and Georgia. I think Georgia is a great example of what happens when you decide that money is just a figment of our imagination. What can you do with that? And I don't think Penn State's quite there, but the fact they could get Jim Knowles, I think, is a thing that doesn't happen a few years ago under Sandy Barber, or even earlier than that. And, Ohio State, of course, has spent the last few months saying, well, we didn't want him anyway, you can have him kind of thing. And
sure,
however true that is, at the same time, he's a highly coveted assistant coach at a position that, I don't know that Penn State really needed to replace. Like, you made a list of things to fix. Defense isn't one at Penn State, but they went out and won a bidding war. And I think that you can replace a lot of positions, but you can't replace mentality as an athletic department. And I think that is an area where they have changed to Penn State's betterment holistically.
When you look at the offense as a whole, we'll keep it holistic. Offense was built out of Tyler Warren last year. Are we almost undervaluing the stamp that he was able to put on this offense? I mean, obviously the running game was there. Obviously Drew Allar's development was there. The offensive line continued to get better. But with the receiver struggles and the different options that Tyler Warren gave them, and the gravity that he sort of imposed on other defenses, that safeties had to be over the top and linebackers constantly had to be aware of where he was, and nickel corners were attempting to do it. Like, can Penn State not replace Tyler Warren, but I think smoothly move into a post-Tyler Warren universe is, I guess, the way I would phrase it.
Yeah. I mean, that's sort of the $10 million question, I guess. I think that, it was funny because I think earlier in the season last year, I don't know that I took the Tyler Warren experience fully seriously, because if you just throw it to a tight end a bunch of times with a bunch of checkdowns and do things against bad teams, it's like, okay, like, we've established that if they had receivers to throw to, they would do that. But sooner or later, somebody's going to slow Tyler Warren down, because, like, how hard is it to slow a tight end down? And that never really happened. And I think that was when you go like, wow, this is a guy who's really dynamic, a guy that I think, to Andy Koltonicki's credit, I think a good pairing for how do you get a Swiss Army knife sort of offensive coordinator to work with a Swiss Army knife kind of player, and how many weird ways can you find to use him? Do they replace him? I think the coach speak answer, like every coach in America says, is, we can't replace the really good players. We just have to find a way to work as a team to, get that production from a bunch of different guys. I do think that Penn State's proven that it can produce tight ends, obviously. I think Luke Reynolds is another guy that's going to come in. I think Khalil Dinkins is a guy that has the ability to really flash. So, from that position, holistically, I'm sure that they will have another good tight end or two this year. Can you do what Tyler Warren did? I don't think that anybody can really do exactly what Tyler Warren did. He was sort of like the Frankenstein's monster of all of the good tight ends that Penn State's had over the last few years, because he's not as athletic as Mike Gesicki, but he's more physical, but he's not as physical as Jesse James, but he's more athletic, and they kind of melded themselves into what he became. So I don't think you replace it, but I think they're going to have to try, because obviously this offense can't run through him this year because he's not around to be a part of it.
He's not there. Yeah.
Yeah.
For your consideration on any podcast player, search Solid Verbal, find us, and hit follow or subscribe. It's just that easy.
Ben, I want to ask you a personality question for a second, because there was a clip floating around that a lot of people saw of James Franklin getting into it with a fan at the spring game. We've seen other combustible moments, I'd say, from him over the years that have also been caught on tape. There is a little bit of pettiness there with James Franklin. I like the guy, but we've seen more than enough of those clips to know that that's kind of lurking below the surface at times. I think in the past we have maybe chalked that up to he needs to get the monkey off his back. He needs to beat Ohio State and Michigan. But Penn State went to the playoffs this year. They were, 3 points away from making the national championship game. Is the monkey off James Franklin's back? Like, what is his personality quirk that we see often when these clips surface on social media? Where is he at? Like, I guess the human being in me wants to know, is the guy happy? How do we assess James Franklin's state of mind in 2025 college football?
Yeah, I mean, welcome to the last, 10 years of my life, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if the monkey is off his back. I think it would have been if they had beaten Notre Dame to a certain extent, because I think that then you go like, if for as good as we can all agree SMU is, and for as good as we can agree Boise State is, and et cetera, the Notre Dame game was a different opportunity for them and they didn't get it done. I don't know, not to unpack that again. I don't know if you look at that game and go like, oh, if James Franklin had done this differently, they would have won. I just think they lost a competitive football game, and that's how it goes sometimes. But that being said, I think James is in a difficult spot of simultaneously knowing that he hasn't done the one thing that everyone wants him to do, while also knowing that Nebraska got rid of Bo Pelini and then Nebraska sucked. And that you should be careful what you wish for, because I get it. You're frustrated, but also how many 10 or 11 win seasons do you want to have? And what sort of satisfaction are you going to get from that? I think it's, challenging for him, because I think he really just wants to be loved. I think James wants to be appreciated. Yes. I think James wants to be appreciated for what they've done. I think he wants to be appreciated for the consistency they've had. And honestly, if somebody's given me, a hard time in April, maybe I give them the finger too and go like, let's check back in October or November. Like, things are doing good. We haven't lost a game yet this year. I think Penn State football is in a weird place because it continues to be the program that everyone would probably like to be, but continues to be the program that's not quite all the programs that everybody really wants to be. So you're stuck between being better than most everyone else, but not being quite good enough. And the hard part is, well, the only teams you have to beat are, 3 of the regular, world-eating programs that are doing this to everyone. And Penn State gets the distinct honor every year of losing by the least to most of them. So it's that sort of issue where you go, well, what else do you want from me? I'm doing the best I can.
Right.
But at the same time, it's a winning business, and Penn State football is not spending $700 million to renovate the stadium, so it can lose to Ohio State again.
I was going to ask you about the renovation. I was going to ask you a little bit later on, but since you brought it up, they are redoing a good chunk of Beaver Stadium. Is the Beaver Stadium construction going to affect the environment, the big game environment at all this year? It's still going to be a lot of people, but the stadium footprint's a little bit different. Does that have any bearing on anything this coming season?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, you take the media core out of that press box, it's going to impact the atmosphere, because you won't be able to hear all those people up there eating ice cream during halftime and whatnot. But I think, like, more seriously, yeah, I mean, I'm sure it will. I mean, they've knocked down the whole, basically half of the one side of the stadium. So just from an acoustic standpoint, there's less, things to bounce noise off of. But it's still a really big stadium. There's still a lot of people in it. Is it going to look a little funky? Sure. Is it going to be a little bit different? Yes. But, at the end of the day, when it comes down to a lot of these really good programs that Penn State's trying to beat, and you look at, I guess, Oregon early on, they're really good teams. Like, when it comes to the third quarter, they're not going to be like, wow, there's 6,000 fewer people on this side of the field than there used to be. That's not going to be the deal breaker.
Right.
So I think it makes a difference. I do think it'll be interesting to see in the long run what that does to the atmosphere when it's done, because they're making it much more rich people seats.
Yeah,
honestly, it's always kind of been that way.
Yeah, the comparison.
But at the same time,
don't mean to cut you off. The comparison that came to mind for me that I was actually a little bit worried about was when they built new Yankee Stadium, and the environment completely changed. It's a beautiful place to watch a game. it is not the same as old Yankee Stadium. It feels different. The acoustics are different. The atmosphere is different. Still a tough place to go and play and win, but that's mostly because of the team and not because it's deafening in there the way it used to be.
Yeah. I do think what will be interesting and might turn it into a bit of a wash is that when it's done, that side of the stadium, for I think anyone who's made it this far is familiar with Beaver Stadium's traditional layout, which is the west side is basically one big sheet of people and then the press box at the end of that. The new version of it is going to have like half of that lower bowl and then 2 upper decks above it. So something maybe similar to Texas A&M comes to mind, but I think anybody can picture what, a 2-tiered seating system can look like. I think that that's going to hold in a lot more sound. When they moved the student section in like the mid 2000s or so, late 2000s, from where it was sort of closer to the 50-yard line to underneath that south end zone, it made it a lot louder because those upper decks down there sort of trapped the noise and reflected it back out a little bit more. So, I'm sure someone at some point over the next 5 or 6 years is going to do a how loud is it on the field at Beaver Stadium thing, because that makes for easy content. But I've got to think that when you trap in more noise, that you might they might be paying $10,000 to be there, but someone else's voice is going to ricochet off that seat. So it could kind of wash out. But at the end of the day, they're going to have 100 and some odd thousand people. And no matter how you do that, unless it's Michigan Stadium, it's going to be loud. So, I think they'll figure it out no matter what. Michigan, for whatever reason, I like going to the big house, but it is not an imposing place in comparison to a lot of places.
This is all right. The stadium improvements, recruiting, portal, paying your coach $8, $9, $10 million. It's all about keeping up. It's all about what the market is demanding of. And obviously Penn State is making the stadium changes because it seems like they're long overdue. That this is a stadium that has needed some updating for quite some time. How far off is Penn State? And not just in one sense, whether it's financially or how they're running their organization. When you go to other places, like for the big house, like the shoe, like wherever, and you see other teams and you see other programs, are there things Penn State internally is saying to itself, we can close the gap by doing X, Y, and Z? We're not that far off, but these are the gaps we need to close. What do you believe Penn State is looking at as those gaps?
Yeah, I think that answer has changed over the last few years, because I think from a facilities standpoint, there are always lots of things that you can improve on. I think that Penn State's football building in general has gotten a lot better over the last few years. They renovated the weight room. It looks nice. They're doing stuff for the field. There's a lot of little things. And, I think sometimes it can be hard to figure out what exactly good branding has to do with 4th and 5. But I do think that it sort of holistically comes together with how you present yourself and how you recruit and the sort of perception that people have of your program. I think Beaver Stadium is Beaver Stadium. It sort of has that Rose Bowl aesthetic of going like, well, you would never build it like this if you did it today.
Right.
But it is the Rose Bowl, so that makes it okay. And I think that Beaver Stadium has certain elements of that. Obviously, I've been to a game a few years ago where the pipes to the bathrooms in the press box froze. So you had to go downstairs to use a trough to, go to the bathroom kind of thing. So there's things that you can go like, all right, that could be better. And they're working on that, and they're winterizing Beaver Stadium and things there. But I think, NIL is an area, and obviously that's a significant moving target on a daily basis. But I do think that for Penn State, the biggest thing for Penn State football is that no matter how the landscape changes, Penn State's too big and makes too much money to ever not be a part of whatever happens next. And I think that puts them a leg ahead of most programs in the country, because they're never going to be left for dead. Like, respectfully, if college football decided tomorrow that it didn't need Northwestern, that there would be no muscle to make that not happen. That Northwestern would go like, oh gosh, well, we really like going to the library anyway. I guess this is fine. But like Penn State's always going to be a part of whatever's next. And I think you can always go to a peer institution and say, we want PS5s in our player lounge, or we want, a sleep deprivation chamber for whatever reason, or, all these things. And you add to those, I think Penn State's in the same tier as everyone else. I think Georgia's sort of the standard. Ohio State's sort of the standard. But I think that holistic gap, especially over the last 24 months or so, has is narrowed about as reasonably as it can at any given moment.
For the sake of balance, we heard a lot about the negative fringes of Ohio State's fan base in the sort of wake of the Michigan loss. I imagine there's an overwhelming percentage of the Penn State fan base that is loving life as a Penn State fan, but also like, when are we going to win just a little bit more? When is James Franklin going to win a couple more of those games that he can't seem to with Penn State? Is there a section of this Penn State monolith, which it obviously isn't, that is just super happy with winning 10, 11 games a year? It could be worse. Things have been catastrophic for Penn State off the field, a decade plus ago, and the reputation seems to be in a much better place for the university and the football program. Is there the upper 5%, 10%, 12% of this fan base that's just like, man, things are awesome. It is awesome to be a Penn State fan, and we are not angry online, and we are not yelling at football games at the coach. Do those people exist just for the sake of balance?
I think they do. I mean, okay. I think, to a certain extent, you don't put 110,000 people or however many it is every week into a stadium because they are grumpy.
True.
I think that there has to be some base level. We have signed up for misery and we are okay with that aspect of sports in general. I'm an Eagles fan. Like until recently, It was a whole lot of maybe next year. And I think that you learn to love maybe next year in spite of this year. But I think, there are people that I think, it's an interesting situation that Penn State's in a lot of ways, because there's a very large subset of people that only ever had one head football coach and knew sort of what that experience was like. And then there's a lot of people that have grown up in the, two head football coaches at this point. I like an NFL team and they fire their coach every other year. I watch the Premier League and they get rid of their managers all the time. That there is this flow of unhappiness and we should fire everyone all the time because you didn't win last night, that I think changes how a certain subset of people talk about sports and the longevity of like the willingness to be like, you want to build a really good college football program, you're probably gonna have to wait a couple of years for that to actually happen. But I think people that, have been around, I think people that understand what it could be, that, especially Penn State football fans that maybe lived through the early 2000s of just being horrible. Like there's a whole bunch of Penn State football fans that have never really experienced truly bad Penn State football. And I think for the people that have experienced that, for people that have watched a lot of college football, you go like, 10 or 11 wins, probably going to be in the playoffs more often than not. That's not a bad place to be. Does that mean that they're not booing on 3rd and 7 in the second quarter against, Kent State when they're going to have to punt because they haven't figured out what they're doing on offense in week 3? Sure. That comes with the territory. But I do think that, everybody understands what the deal is, and some people are just better at embracing it than others.
Yeah. And to that point, Dan, I mean, I think I told you. My shuttle driver a couple of weeks ago coming back from the Mazda dealership was one of these fans who is just, all I do is watch Penn State football. I don't care about your podcast. I didn't tell him about the podcast, but I don't care about nationally what's going on. I just watch Penn State on Saturdays. They've got a pretty good team. They got to play in the playoff, even though they lost to Ohio State. This is the conversation we had. That guy exists. He was happy as a lark. Maybe we'll get him next year, but it was definitely not a pejorative, Ben, right? He was looking forward to the fact that even though they lost to Ohio State, we still have all this to play for. Still, we're only a couple points away from getting to the title game for a rematch against Ohio State. Things are looking up. So, yes, that guy is definitely out there, Dan.
I'm glad to hear it. I'm positive he and she are, but I want to stay actually positive with here. Just on the same token, you don't accidentally win 10 games a year in college football. It's never been more difficult with obviously adding in quality teams to the Big Ten and how good Michigan and Ohio State have been recently. What is James Franklin's superpower?
I mean, I think that they have a formula that they know what works. And, we can make the jokes about, the games they don't win or whatnot. Right. But I think that he's good with relationships. He's good with culture building. I imagine that there are a lot of things that we don't know about that happen in the football building, just in terms of how you keep everybody happy. And I'm not saying financially, I'm just saying in general. But I think that, Penn State's had a good reputation, especially in the transfer portal era, of pretty much keeping everybody that they wanted around. Like they're not a program that produces really good players and then they all leave. Like the fact that Nick Singleton and Kaytrone Allar are both on the same football team for the umpteenth millionth year in a row during a time where they could both go somewhere else and make a lot more money to be by themselves, it probably speaks to things we don't know about, but I also think it speaks to I am happy where I'm at. And I think a lot of that has to do with how you build your culture. A lot of that has to do with, James has always notoriously said that, like, I don't promise people playing time. Like he doesn't promise recruits playing time. He doesn't promise freshmen or previous starters. I mean, I remember a few years ago, he used to say that when Saquon was around, and he's like, except for Saquon's going to start. So there was like a certain amount of that element. Abdul Carter is going to start. But I think that transparency, you kind of know what you're getting out of that program. And I think because of that, it's easier to buy into it. And that doesn't mean that there aren't unhappy people or that people don't transfer because they're, not happy. But I think the culture, I think the consistency, and I think, frankly, we don't talk about this as much, but Penn State sends a lot of guys to the NFL.
Yeah.
Like from the college football perspective, they don't win all the big games, but they're as good as anybody within reason at producing NFL quality players. And I think that if you're a high school football player, like, what do you really care about? Like, yeah, it'd be nice to beat Ohio State, but also it'd be nice to be Abdul Carter. And one of those things is slightly more obtainable than the other. But I think if you are producing good players, if you have a good atmosphere and a quality experience, you're going to be able to win a lot of football games. And I think that that's part of the reason why some programs, have a harder time is, when you just spend 10 years beating people over the head with a stick, nobody wants to play for you. And that really hasn't been the best that I can tell from the outside, and best that you would think would bear truth over an extended period of time, not, what happens inside that Lash building.
You mentioned Abdul Carter, third overall. Penn State had a very successful draft. I think we tend to look at Penn State, as you mentioned earlier, Ben, as having these defensive superstars that have emerged in the NFL over the last couple of years, really over the last couple of decades. And there has been this tendency to just kind of next man up, right? To your point from earlier, recruiting's been strong. Defensively, they do have that brand. People want to buy into that brand because it can help put them in the league. Abdul Carter leaves. We know they've got denied Dennis Sutton still on the roster. It's still going to be loaded defensively, but is your mindset coming into this new season that the defense, especially now under Jim Knowles, is going to pick up where it left off and be just as good, if not better? We haven't talked a lot about defense because I think we assume as fact that it will be good, but how good, in your view, is this defense coming into this new season?
Yeah, I mean, I think a little bit like you said, my working assumption, sort of opposite to the receivers at this point, is until Penn State has a bad defense, I'm going to assume that it's good. The one thing that has sort of transcended all of the change of the last 10 or 15 years is that no matter how many defensive coordinators or head coaches Penn State has, it has a defensive identity that's just sort of intrinsic to the program, and it finds a way to be really good. So, I don't know that the Tom Allen experience, in some ways, I think Tom Allen got a raw deal because I think that, like, he had to come in after Brent Pry and Manny Diaz, two of the better defensive minds in college football, had really good players and really good success. And Tom Allen was forced to do things like admit that sometimes the defense was going to give up a first down and occasionally the opponent was going to score points. And that was sort of like the bar for, this is not acceptable that someone has scored more than 10 points in a game. That I think that was a hard, you can't go from Manny Diaz basically had one of, if not the best defenses in America the year before. And then Tom Allen's like, oh, so I'm supposed to be that good or better. That being said, I think that I feel like this is not a new observation, but Tom Allen's sort of a weird dude. Like in his own sort of like quirky head football coach drinks too much Red Bull kind of way.
Sure.
And I don't know how well that jived with everything. I think it's fair to say that the defense wasn't maybe quite up to where Penn State fans and Penn State as a program has come to expect it to be. So I imagine that it will be better. I think, like you said, they've got pieces to plug in there and go, okay, we feel good about our base, and then let's fill in from there. I think Jim Knowles, obviously, it'll be an interesting exercise in how good can you make a defense when you have all the best defensive players in America versus how good can you make a defense when you maybe have to work with a few more things. And that's not to say that Jim Knowles doesn't know what he's doing, but everything's different from Ohio State. But I suppose you could argue that Penn State defense is as comparable as it gets to a place like Ohio State. So I don't think it'll be worse. I don't know if it'll be markedly better because I still think it was fine. But yeah, until Penn State's got a bad defense, I don't have it in me to say, oh yeah, they're going to struggle, because they don't. And honestly, who is worried about UCLA?
Fair enough. Did the Knowles move surprise you?
I would say so. I mean, I think both from a spending perspective, I think this got into a little bit of, from my vantage point, a little bit of a what measuring contest, because it was like, well, we really want him. No, we really want him. And I think Pat Kraft was like, damn it, we're going to get him. And like, let's give him everything he's ever wanted. So that surprised me a little bit. And I think, to a certain extent, I mean, obviously, since Penn State didn't have a defensive coordinator, it was going to need one. But if you were going to make a list of what would you have changed about Penn State football's 24-25 season, it wasn't, well, they need to clearly go out and get the best defensive coordinator available. They've proven to be good with plenty of other guys. So I think it surprised me a little bit, just because they could have spent less money and probably gotten similar results. But it's not my money. So if that's how they want to spend it, I guess that's their prerogative.
Get rich or die trying, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Get rich or die trying. So it surprised me a little bit, but at the same time, I think it was a big win for Penn State, and we'll see if it's a big win for them on the field, I guess.
On that token, Penn State has had consistent success by and large, on both sides of the ball, relative to a lot of teams that play college football. And one of the interesting storylines with Jim Knowles last year was how much he was or wasn't empowered to run his defense, sort of butting heads with assistants who were there forever, who had their own way of thinking about defense. I assume that Jim Knowles is going to be empowered to whatever extent he wants to be empowered. For that much money, you don't pay somebody to take notes all the time. How do you believe he is fitting in? How do you believe he has been empowered? Do you believe this Penn State defense is actually going to look noticeably different than successful recent ones that, both Manny Diaz and Tom Allen have put on the field?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll see what the specifics are. I think James has been pretty consistent when it comes to hiring coordinators in particular, that you want them to bring their identity along with them, that what made them good is what made them good. But at the same time, I think Penn State can quite obviously lean on a blueprint of, this is what our identity is, and we want you to fit into that as well. So I think there's a little bit of mix and match. Because you're right. You don't hire a guy like Jim Knowles to have him open up a Google Doc and say, this is what Brent Pry ran 3 years ago. We're going to do that. But at the same time, I do think that there's some base concepts and base sort of identity that's going to make Penn State football defense what it's always been. In terms of autonomy, I think the whole James Franklin meddles too much thing is something that conveniently comes up every time something doesn't go well. It never comes up when it's successful. It is miraculous that James Franklin can be an offensive mind and meddle so much in the defense, and it works. But anytime something bad offensively happens, it's suddenly because he won't let them do their job. Is there some head coach getting on the headset to cause not problems, but to have input? I think Penn State pays James Franklin a lot of money not to have input in the middle of a crucial game. But at the same time, I think that, he ascribes to the notion that these guys are the head coaches of their positions and their units. And, I think that's probably the case. And I think he'll have that autonomy. And obviously, I think we've seen historically that when things have not gone well for Penn State, Kirk Shiraka offensively was not working out. And I think James had a hand in sort of turning that around a little bit. I think there were probably times last year with Tom Allen, but frankly, I think a head coach has got too much stuff to do to really get in the way of your offensive meetings on a real significant basis every day and every week. So I would anticipate that Jim Knowles, they're paying him a lot of money to go do what he does. And I imagine that that's going to be the case.
We've spent a majority of this time, this is my final question, talking about why things have worked out really, really well for Penn State over these past few years. Why Penn State is thought of to be a top 1, 2, 3, 4 type team in the nation this year. If they're not, if Penn State is merely good but not really good or great, if they are a 9-3 team, God forbid they lose 3 games this year, what's the reason?
I mean, if we throw out the injury thing,
sure,
which I think obviously like everyone gets hurt and they suck. If we get rid of that sort of caveat, I mean, I think it comes down to the receivers don't quite step up, and the guys that aren't Tyler Warren aren't Tyler Warren. I think in this day and age, you've got to be a diverse team offensively. I think Nick Singleton and Kaytrone Allen can get you pretty far. But they can only do so much. You've got to be diverse. So I think if they don't win those games, it's a product of they're not developing in the areas that they need to. But you look at the schedule. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think at Iowa is one of those games that's perpetually overlooked by people who don't watch Big Ten football because Iowa is just like a hellscape place to play. But yeah, I mean, other than Oregon, Iowa, Ohio State, and maybe just sort of like frustratingly unconstipated Michigan State in the middle of November, there's not a lot of games that you go like they should lose that or they could lose that. I think probably more realistically. So to me, they've got to have some pretty systemic issues to go 9-3. And I think that Penn State has proven that they can find ways to beat everyone that they should. I think that has been their strength, that whatever their weaknesses are against equal or better teams, that Penn State really does not lose the games that it shouldn't. And I think even they've done that with teams that are not as highly regarded as this one might be. So for them to fail, I think they'd have to just really not have it together. And, frankly, I don't think that there's a reason to believe that that'll be the case.
You can find his work, Ben Jones, on pennstate.substack.com. Did I get that right, Ben? I believe that's the URL.
I think that's close. I think that was right. It's close enough for me, and I right there. So
beautiful. Go and check out Ben's work. Support what he does. Always thoughtful. I love your commentary. You do an awesome job. Thank you again for giving us so much of your time. We'll talk again soon.
All right. Appreciate you, fellas. Go Birds.
All right, there you go. Go and check out Ben's work, Ben Jones, on pennstate.substack.com. Always a pleasure to have him with us here on the program. What do you think of Penn State football right now? What do you think of these expectations that have been, it sounds like I'm being negative about
foisted
this, but
on Penn State?
Levied upon them,
yeah.
Dan. Is it too much?
No, because you look at the teams that they're being compared against, and there's more that is familiar and returning about Penn State, and more that when you look at what's been added to Penn State, notably Jim Knowles, you understand what you're getting, Jim Knowles. You are likely getting one of the 5 best defenses in America, considering what Penn State brings back. And it's always been my opinion that the best teams have the best combination of defense and quarterback, and it's hard to argue, even with Penn State's results throwing the ball against Notre Dame in their final game of the season, that, yes, we expect Texas's defense to be very good, and we expect Arch Manning to be very good. We expect Oregon and Dante Moore and their Oregon's defense to be a good combination. We expect Georgia's defense and the development of Gunnar Stockton to be very impressive. We expect a lot of these things from a lot of the powers. We expect Julian Sayin to develop into a very good quarterback. I don't think he's officially been named the starter at Ohio State, but he's the expected starter. And even with what Ohio State is returning on defense and not returning on defense, we expect it to be quality. But there just seems to be more known about Penn State with that combination. And then you add in the running backs, you add in the offensive line, you add in the pass rushers and the potential star power on this defense, even with losing, Abdul Carter and Kobe King's gone, right? They had losses on all 3 levels. James Franklin has earned the benefit of the doubt that he is going to field a 10-plus win team. And this sport is very good at giving us teams that seem like that they've hit, that seems as if they've hit a ceiling at 8, 9, 10, 11 wins or whatever. And then there are just special lightning in a bottle years. And the understanding is that Penn State is 100% a candidate to be that kind of team this year, more so than many others.
The 2 biggest games on this schedule are end of September at home against Oregon.
Yes.
And the beginning of November on the road against Ohio State. There are other games on this thing that could be interesting, right? At UCLA with Nico, I don't think Penn State should lose that game, but it's a little bit more interesting now than it was. At Iowa, Ben mentioned what a hellscape that has been for Penn State. He is correct in saying that. They also get Indiana at home a week after that Ohio State game.
That's tricky, depending on what Indiana
looks like. I think that could be tricky.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know how high or not we should be on Indiana. We'll get to that at some point in July, talk through exactly what we think of the Hoosiers this year, but they're going to be better than the old Indiana for sure.
Right.
I think we've kind of arrived at this point, though, where anything worse than 10-2, to the question you asked, Ben, anything worse than 10-2, it kind of feels like a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not rooting for that, obviously, but you come into this season, I think, with a pretty high floor if you're Penn State, right? It should be 10-2 worst case scenario,
right?
Given what's coming back and what's on this schedule. I don't want to deal with the possibility of the fact that they could go 9-3. There's potential for that, but coming into this year, you feel pretty good. You feel pretty good, and if all goes well, even if they do end up going 10-2 and can't knock off one of those two quote unquote better teams, it should still be a playoff team.
Right.
They should be playing for this thing again.
And it actually feels like you have to go way back to 2023 when Penn State, coming off of the Utah Rose Bowl win and bringing back as much as they were, they're like, it's just the best team in the country. And they lose to Michigan and Ohio State. And so there is that, obviously, a reasonable conversation to be had that is Penn State simply a business class program? That, sure, they're flying to Geneva, and it's a beautiful plane, and they have business class seats, and it's a much better place to be on the plane than everybody flying coach. But they can't help but notice that the people in front of them have warmer cookies, warmer towels, and there's just a little bit more bite to that champagne that they're getting up there in first class. And that Penn State under James Franklin is doomed to have tepid chocolate chip cookies.
Oh my gosh. So many metaphors going on here.
Simile? Metaphor? I don't know. But no, they're unique in that position because there have been other teams in that position that have broken through for one special year, and Penn State is just still looking for that one special year. And there have been really good years. There have been years that have ended up in the Rose Bowl, ended up in the playoff, and but it's just just a little more. There needs to be a little bit more hot fudge on that Sunday. And
as you apparently do not remember from elementary school, as you apparently also do not remember from elementary school, similes are comparisons that use like or as.
Yes.
Metaphors are a little bit more theater of the mind.
Right. Well, when I said simile, though, I said it's like a business class.
Oh, it's like. I didn't catch the like.
Maybe it was an implied like, Ty. I apologize.
So I'm a jerk now. That's fine. Anyway, look, right in. We have a lot of Penn Staters that listen to the show.
Yeah.
Curious to get your input on these expectations. I think that's what I'm reacting to the most, and that's what I reacted to the most when we decided to put the show together. Like, what? Ari Wasserman took a dump on us. Okay?
When?
I love Ari. He took a dump, though, on the Penn State community by putting these expectations on Penn State.
Oh, yeah. No, I've seen a couple places. I think Fox had
It's not just Ari. It's Mark Schlabach, I think, did it as well.
Sure.
They're being complimentary of Penn State, and at the same time, I kind of don't want to take that compliment because I'm afraid.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. So, yes, it should be a good team, but I am, frankly, a little bit nervous about what that means.
Mm-hmm.
What that means if they don't get to that level. That's where I'm at as a very superstitious fan.
Yeah, I mean, look, the second halves specifically of the Oregon and the Ohio State games will be fascinating because both of those games last season, they don't have Michigan this year, right? It's a different Michigan program right now, but those are the two circled games. And those are two games last season in which there was a weird, uneven, it was a quick start for Penn State last year, right? They had an early pick six, I want to say, or interception that set something up. I have to go back and watch. But they were in a nice position. And when Ohio State adjusted and they were more successful on offense, Penn State couldn't counter. Penn State didn't have an offensive touchdown in that game, right?
Right.
And then in the Oregon game, it's just back and forth. Oregon, They have a key interception that leads to a 1-yard touchdown. And Penn State in the second half, it was just a couple of times where they couldn't keep a drive going, and Oregon was able to sustain drives and couldn't get it done. It's just that second half, okay, we see what this team is doing and going for game plan wise. Here's our counter. Penn State fell short of that last year. Obviously fell short against Notre Dame, but that game is crazy tight back and forth at the end.
That was a winnable game for Penn State.
You know what?
Penn State could have won that game. In a different universe, they do win that game.
Something that I was reminded of during draft time, I think, just because so many things are happening all the time in life. Abdul Carter playing at 40% and being effective in the playoff.
Oh, yeah.
Like the injuries he was dealing with, obviously the offensive issues were what they were against Notre Dame and general later on in the season, but they should be in a really nice place this year.
Listen, people are going to listen to what I just said, and they're going to be like, what are you, an idiot? Would you not want to be ranked number one?
Right.
That is not what I'm saying. It just frightens me. Whenever you put those kind of expectations
it's a different
on
number.
Anybody. Yeah, it feels heavy as the head.
Right.
That wears that crown in the preseason especially. And so, yeah, it worries me that they can't get to that level, but it should be a good team. It should be a fun season, and the schedule sets up, well, there's a lot there for them. The fact that they were able to retain the guys that they were, even with losing the talent that they did, it's there for them, man. They really don't have an excuse.
You could make an argument that their combination of coordinators is, if it's not the best in the country,
it's impeccable.
It's
impeccable.
One of the best 3, best 4. It's all. I mean, it's just things have aligned very nicely for Penn State, and it definitely feels like, if not now, when. And
I'm with you.
It can happen in 3 years. It can. I don't know who's next at quarterback for Penn State, but it feels as ready-made and white glove as any team has had it that hasn't broken through lately.
People are really big on Ethan Grunkemeyer.
Is that true?
So,
good name.
Very good name. More importantly, and we can close with this, thank you to everybody for downloading, for listening, for supporting, going out to verballers.com for more. The clock is ticking now. We're recording this on Thursday, May the 22nd. I have not gone on out to daysuntil.com to get the official day count for how long it will be until that game, Penn State hosting Oregon on September the 27th.
All right, I'll look it up right now. Okay.
But I would say roughly you and I have about 4 months to figure out how the hell logistically we're going to pull this off. Because you've booked the flight.
You said September 27th?
September 27th.
I did book the flight without really thinking about it if it were a night game.
You're flying in. The night game element of this could definitely throw a bit of a monkey wrench in our normal plans, which is we're going to do the midnight live stream. We still want to do the midnight live stream. We just need a little bit of help from the community to figure out how we could do all of these things, go to the game, enjoy, Penn State versus Oregon, and still, I'm assuming somewhere up in State College, if it is a night game, do the midnight broadcast.
Yes.
So if anybody out there has any ideas,
well, it's not just that. I got to figure out how to get back home.
And how to get back home.
We have 3,072 hours to devise an itinerary, provided that I think NBC is broadcasting that game at 7 or 7:30 Eastern.
Which means inevitably that you and I will save this until the final 72 hours to figure out what our plan is.
Obviously, yes.
solidverbal@gmail.com if you have any ideas. We'd appreciate that. All right. Thanks again to Ben Jones for stopping on by. We appreciate his insight as always. Go and check him out, Ben Jones, on pennstate.substack.com. You can, of course, check us out, solidverbal.com. Hit follow, hit subscribe, wherever it is you are listening to this episode. We'll be here all off season. Have a happy Memorial Day if you're here in the States. In the meantime, until next time, I am Ty. He is Dan. As always, you know the drill. Stay solid.
Peace.